So thank you, Fred, for coming along. Many of you will know, in fact, probably all of you know quite a lot about Fred, at least from his public persona. If not his blog, then his amazing work in venture capital here in New York. So Fred was correct me if I get any of this wrong, but a graduate of MIT in engineering, then also a graduate of the Wharton School of Business at UPenn. And then pretty early on was a venture capitalist in New York City at Euclid Ventures. Then he founded his own fund, the Flatiron Ventures.
Partners,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
And then in sort of a classic kind of New York City move, his next big step was moving like 9 blocks downtown, Union Square Ventures, which is the one I think we're all probably more familiar with, that funded companies like Twitter and Tumblr and Foursquare and Delicious and a whole bunch of other companies that
no one pulls that one out anymore.
Well, we know Josh Schachter. Josh Schachter. We in fact tried to hire Josh Schachter here, so it's sort of a it's a bittersweet thing.
You know he's unhirable.
He didn't actually join Google, but then he's now. You see, he's building these robots, the whiteboard robots.
He's great.
So I'm not going to go into much more description, except to say that Fred is one of the very few people I think who've made a significant individual contribution to the technology ecosystem here in New York City. I think when people think, around the world think of tech in New York City, they think of Fred as somebody who's enabled that and encouraged that and pushed that forward, and furthermore is the voice of that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, I think, today, but also about one of Fred's passions, which is also a passion, I think, of a lot of us here, which is computer science education, which is in a fairly terrible state and is really standing in the way of progress of the tech community and the community in general here in New York and elsewhere. But with that, welcome, Fred. Thank you for coming. So I'm kind of interested, first off, you were kind of in venture capital early, it seems like.
Yeah.
How did you fall into that? Was that focused? Is that something you happened into?
It really came out of the decision that my wife and I made to move to New York in the early 80s. And I'd been at MIT and was an engineer. I didn't major in computer science, but I put myself through MIT by writing software, and then got a job here in New York writing software, but not for a startup. Right. And all my friends from MIT were working in Cambridge at places like Lotus. Now I'm dating myself because this is 1983. Or moving out to Silicon Valley and working for PC software companies, or even PC hardware companies, which was the thing of the day. Right. And I wanted to do that, but I was living in New York, and my wife was really committed to staying here. And so I started trying to think about how I could stitch that all together. And New York still is, and certainly was at the time, the finance capital of the world. And so I kind of landed on this idea that I could marry finance with technology and startups. And then I discovered that there was this thing called venture capital, which I honestly had never heard of before. Did a bunch of research on that, and then I tried to get a job, and everybody said you had to get an MBA, so then I went and got an MBA. I wrote my application to business school saying I wanted to be a venture capitalist, and I managed to get a job. MBA is usually a 2-year program. I got a job the summer between my 2 years working at a venture capital firm in New York, and I've basically been doing venture capital ever since. That was 1986, so right. I've been doing it for close to 30 years. And you're right, I was basically didn't know anything when I got into the venture business. I knew how to write software.
Right.
But back then, that was like less of a thing. Now we won't hire somebody if they can't write software.
Sure. Well, fortunately, it's a little more common than it was, but it needs to be more common yet by, I don't know, maybe an order of magnitude. I don't know.
Well, but we have this one young analyst who works for us, and yesterday he was talking about this open source messenger called Telegraph, and his way of doing research on Telegraph was to build a bot for Telegraph on their new, launched last week bot platform. And that makes so much sense, right? If you want to figure something out,
right,
make something with it, right?
Keep poking
right?
at it.
And so I think that's why it's so important in my business to have those kinds of skills.
Right. So how have you seen, since in the last, what are we talking about, 20 plus years, what have you noticed happening in the New York tech scene? I mean, what do you think of the trends and where we're going?
It's night and day. mean, it really is night and day. If you go back 20 years to the mid 90s when we started Flatiron Partners, there wasn't. I don't think there was more than one or two venture capital firms that had real a focus in New York, and most technologists would not choose to graduate from Carnegie Mellon or MIT or anywhere and come to New York and make a career here. The companies that did exist were very vertically focused, so they were companies that served Wall Street or served the publishing industry, which is a horrible way to make money, and there weren't that many of them. And I think today, everybody knows that if you want to be an entrepreneur or you want to be a software engineer in a startup, that you can do that in New York.
Right.
And that one thing, to me, is probably 80% of what's changed. Doesn't mean that people don't start amazing companies in other places, and it'll always be the case that New York will only be a part of the tech sector, but it's a meaningful part of the tech sector. In the United States, it's probably the second most active startup hub after Silicon Valley, and that's a big deal, I think.
Yeah. So what is it about New York that you mentioned your wife really wanted to be here, and you decided to focus on New York, even apart from technology? What is it? And this is kind of a self-congratulatory question for all of us who have chosen to be in New York, but what is it that makes you want to live here?
Well, I think it's everything else that you can have outside your work life. I talked to a venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley quite a few years ago now, maybe 5-7 years ago, and he said, the reason I like investing in companies in Silicon Valley is that there's nothing else to do, so the engineers will work till 2 or 3 in the morning. And he said, in New York, they all leave the office by like 9 or 10 and then go out, for beers with their friends or something. And I said, that's why I live in New York, right? Like I want that. I want to be able to do other things. And I also think that besides the lifestyle issues, the other thing that to me is so amazing about New York is that if you're well, let's say you have kids and you're going to a soccer game on the weekends, and you're on the sideline cheering on your kids. Next to you will be somebody who's a writer, and then on the other side of you will be somebody who owns a restaurant, and there'll be somebody who's works in government, and then there'll be, somebody who works on Wall Street. Like this is very.
Whereas I think there's a cartoon about this where in the Valley it's like, there's the tech lawyer and the tech writer and the tech,
on the
tech
soccer,
restaurateur.
If you're on the soccer field in Silicon Valley, you have people who work at Google, people who work at Facebook, people who work on Sand Hill Road in the venture business.
And they're not bad people.
No, I'm not making a negative comment here. It's just that there's a diversity of kind of culture and work and life that you get in New York that I think is really positive. And I think it does, by the way, that does feed into the startup ecosystem as well. And I think there was an article, I don't remember the exact number, but something like 40% of the companies that are started in New York are started by female founders, or maybe it was 40% of the employees are female or something like that. That's because a lot of these companies are e-commerce focused, or a lot of these companies are media focused, or focused on problems that women are more interested in. And I think that because of the diversity of kinds of companies that get created here, you see a diversity of employee base that maps pretty well to that. And so that's what I think New York has going for it. It's no more expensive to live here than it is to live in Silicon Valley. That's not to say it's ridiculous to live in New York. That's our biggest problem, I think, probably.
Yeah.
The one thing that we have here in New York, though, that I think does mitigate a little bit about that is that we have the outer boroughs.
Right.
So, as Brooklyn gentrifies, and as Queens gentrifies, and as the Bronx gentrifies, there are neighborhoods in those boroughs with good mass transit where you can live. And I think Silicon Valley struggles from that because a lot because of its topography with the Bay and kind of constrained spaces. I think that New York is, even as expensive as it is, it's a little bit more livable.
Yeah, yeah, and we have lots of people who commute in from out in New Jersey, for example. The hub and spoke model of Manhattan works incredibly well, whereas Silicon Valley, there's almost no hub. It's all kind of spread out.
But we have mass transit. I mean, as horrible as New Jersey Transit is, and Metro North is, and Long Island Railroad is, and the New York City subway system is, we have it.
Right, correct, exactly.
And we take it for granted, I suppose, right? Like, it's nothing for me to think about, like hopping on the subway and going out to Citi Field. Right. But it's kind of amazing that you can do that.
No, I agree. So what's standing in the way of the tech ecosystem in New York? Like, what do you think needs to be fixed in order for us to get to? I don't know if we ever get to par with Silicon Valley. That's also an interesting question, whether we need to get there. But what are the big bottlenecks right now?
I think talent.
Yeah.
To my mind, is the number one thing. Every one of our companies has a voracious appetite for particularly engineering talent, but also design talent, product management talent. I think New York particularly suffers from a dearth of really strong product management talent. That may not be true here at Google, but I find that when our portfolio companies look for product management talent, they oftentimes go hunting in Silicon Valley and try to relocate people here. There isn't, in Silicon Valley there was, the enterprise software industry and the personal computer industry and some other industries that taught people how to be really good product managers, and those skills are, that discipline of being a product manager maps pretty well as you move from software to web to mobile. And in New York, we could do that with marketing people, we could do that with finance people, but we didn't really have this, base of product management talent. So I think that's one area that's particularly challenging here in New York. But in general, these technical skills, and I do consider them technical skills. I don't mean that in a negative way, but you have to actually really be good at this stuff. Whether it's design or software engineering or product management, and really know your stuff to make good products. And we still have too little of that. And so, everything we can do to make New York a magnet for people to relocate here, or to create our own organic pool of talent, is really important.
Right. So, drilling in maybe a little bit to your portfolio companies, or maybe more generally to companies founded in New York City, what do you see as the big successes, and how do we create even more successes without having too many Googlers leave and start them?
Well, the companies that we've been involved with here in New York, who I think have gone on to build the most solid and sustainable businesses that are still independent, would be probably Etsy, MongoDB, Kickstarter. I'm going to leave somebody out, which I'm going to feel really badly about. Even companies like Meetup.com and Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange would be in that category. People would point to companies like Tumblr, but Tumblr got sold. So, is it a great company? Maybe, but it's not an independent company anymore. So harder to really point to that one. And I think in many of these cases, one of the keys was that these companies had business models from day one. Etsy had a business model the day they launched. Kickstarter had a business model the day they launched. MongoDB had the open source business model. Meetup moved to a paid model relatively early in their life. Stack figured out how to marry, a careers business with their platform. So I'm a big fan of, if you're starting a business, you're in business, and you need to build a business, and you can't just, keep making software and hoping that, like revenue shows up at your door. So that, I think, is maybe the number one characteristic I would point to that has made these companies be able to do what they do. Right.
So you mentioned the talent problem with respect to product managers, and you're pretty interested in general in how do we create more computer science, engineering talent
Right.
within New York. So tell us a little bit about how you came to that as a focus for not just your sort of business mind, but also your philanthropic endeavors and what you're working on there.
Well, for me, it started with, my big breakthrough in my own professional life was learning how to write code. And that opened up opportunities for me that allowed me to put myself through MIT, allowed me to put myself through Wharton, allowed me to get my first job out of school, and even, frankly, got me into the venture capital business, because the first venture firm that hired me was attracted to that skill, even though they didn't expect me to write code, but they thought because I knew how to write code, I would be able to help them invest in software companies. And so, I guess I sort of feel like this is something that was a life changer for me, and probably was a life changer for a lot of people in this room. And also, just looking at the trends, it seems like it's going to be more important than ever going forward. And so if I'm going to give back, I want to give back to something that matters to me,
Right.
that made a difference for me, and I want to try to make that available to as many people as possible. So that's where it comes from. There was also, frankly, a self-interested piece of it, which is, hey, if we have more organic talent pool to pick from, then we can help staff the companies that get created here in New York. And that actually came from a couple of Google engineers. I wrote a blog post about this is now going back at least 6 or 7 years ago, about my growing interest in computer science, K through 12 education. And a couple of engineers here at Google left comments on my blog and said, hey, there's this guy named Mike Szymanski who basically runs a computer science program at Stuyvesant High School. You should go see him. And I did go see him, and Mike's been a friend and an advisor. We don't always agree on everything, but it's hard to agree with Mike on everything. And that was an early kind of introduction to the New York City public school system. And what Mike has created at Stuyvesant is unbelievable. I mean, literally, there's the kids that come out of that program go on to the best computer science programs in the country, and many of them do come back here because their families are here, and they grew up here, and they can now get good jobs here, maybe right here at Google.
Or anybody in the room went through Stuyvesant?
We got one.
All right. There's a bunch around.
And so that was like an aha moment for me. I'm like, yeah, we should need more of this. And then I got to the social justice piece of it from there, which was that there are whole swaths of the New York City public school system where the kids never ever get close to computer science. And by the way, it's assumed that they can't learn it.
Right.
And that's the piece of it that really kind of bugs me, because I think that if you have the motivation and the curiosity and the tenacity to grind through it, you don't need to be an amazing mathematician.
Right.
There's certain realms of computer science where I think that's true, but it's certainly not true for all computer science. And
I think most of us spend our days adding 1 to numbers. That's the extent of the sort of the deep math that we do.
But there are
I
people,
agree, there are exceptions, but mostly.
There's people who believe that, if you're not, a top achiever, if you're not a rocket scientist, if you're not a math genius, you can't learn this stuff. And I just don't think that's true. And so that's the piece that maybe really kind of reeled me in at the end of the day in a most material way, is to see kids who really don't have strong academic credentials, but are really curious about, how do I make a program on my smartphone? And you teach them how to do it, and they just, boom, the world lights up for them. And
Right.
and all of a sudden, someone called it superpowers. Like, I have superpowers now. I can do this thing that most people can't do. And it gets kids motivated to come to school. It gets kids motivated to think about, what am I going to do when I graduate from high school? Am I going to go to college? Am I going to get a job? Like, all of a sudden, they start seeing opportunities, and they're excited about life, and it's just, no, there's other things that can do that for them, right? I mean, it's not just computer science. I mean, if you fell in love with, design, that could do it for you, or you fell in love with music, it could do it for you. But it lights up something for people in themselves, and so that's what kind of the thing that really got me completely, totally into it. And I am completely, totally into it now.
Yeah, that's great. So given you're an expert on basically the various opportunities within New York City to get involved, I wondered if you could give us kind of a brief tutorial on what the various options are and what their aims are. Because one thing I have a problem with is like, oh wow, there's a new initiative that I could get involved in teaching kids at this time of the day or this time of the year, and could you sort of map it out for us? What are the interesting things going on that people should be thinking about?
Well, the two probably most well-known programs that have a volunteer component to them are the Script Ed program, which was mentioned by I forget his name now, the guy who opened things up, which is it started out as an after-school program and now has an in-school program, and that's and the cool thing about Script Ed is they teach kids software engineering, and then the best performers get the opportunity to go into summer internships that they also help place them in. Wow. So it's not just an education piece, but there's also a summer internship program piece, and they have hackathons, and it's a really great program, and it's also a little bit easier in terms of the amount of time that you have to put in. It's still a good amount of time, but it's not a big time commitment. The second one, which is a bigger time commitment, is called TEALS. This is a program that came out of some Microsoft engineers in Seattle who started going into public schools in Seattle, and now TEALS is available probably in 20 cities around the country, and TEALS is, I think, maybe in 20 or 30 schools, and there it's a more intensive model. You co-teach either an Intro CS class or an AP CS class with a teacher. So you are co-teaching the class with the teacher. Most of the time, you actually have to go to the school and be there for the hour or the 45 minutes of the class. They are experimenting with videoing into classes, which I think, if it can work, will be a great thing. And I think where that model likely is headed is probably more into the world of AP, because what's happening in computer science education is that it is now really a growth thing, and there's a lot of schools picking it up, and a lot of teachers are starting to learn how to teach intro, and but the AP stuff is still pretty hard, and could benefit a lot from having a real software engineer there to either there virtually or there in person to help students. There's always that point where a student gets stuck, and just being able to unstick the student is a big move. And I think being a software engineer, a real-world software engineer, makes it easier to do that than if you're a teacher and you're still kind of dealing in the realm of theory as opposed to practice.
Right. And I do like the idea of teaching alongside a real actual teacher, because they know how to keep the classroom in kind of good form, because that turns out not to be trivial.
They do classroom management, they do all of the homework assignments, they do all the testing and grading and deal with the principal and all that stuff, and all the software engineer has to do is show up, co-teach the class, go home. Yeah. There's a little bit of upfront professional development that has to be done, just so when you show up you actually kind of know what the curriculum is and you're familiar with it, but it's not that much. So those are the two programs now. I think there's going to be more and more volunteer opportunities, because I can't say too much, but in the next week New York City is going to make a big announcement about a massive expansion of computer science, and I don't want to get out in front of that, so I'll stop there. But I think as part of that expansion, I think there's going to be more and more volunteer activities, and that the thing that we've learned is if we make the volunteer activities more bite-sized, and I heard that Google has a 20-hour thing. Right. So if we said to somebody, we'll take those 20 hours, and you can give them to us, an hour at a time, or maybe 3 hours 6 times or something like that, and we make it really easy for people to do this, more people would opt into it. I think what we've learned is asking a small number of people to give us 100 hours is too much. We better ask 100 people, to give us 20 hours. Right. And so I think that's where we're going to go. We've got more work to do, and one of the things that we probably need to do is use technology. You've got these portals where you show volunteer opportunities to your workers here. We need to figure out how to put our volunteer opportunities into your. Yeah.
I think some of them are already, but we should definitely make sure everything's represented.
Right.
Yeah. And so the mailing lists are great, by the way, just to plug those again. And actually, before I forget, I must say thank you to Andrew Frank, who's standing down the back here, who's been the energy behind a lot of these initiatives, and also invited Fred along and twisted his arm to come. So thanks, Andrew, for putting this all together.
Well, I mean, to me, my partner Albert calls Google's New York office team the gift that Google gave New York. And I think that a lot of what we talked about could not have happened without Google making a huge commitment to New York City, because you bring talented people here to work here, and some of them bleed off into other companies. But the opposite is also true. People come here and work for startup companies that maybe we're invested in, with the knowledge that if that doesn't work out, maybe they can come here. And so
I think we've lowered the risk a little bit of coming to New York and basing yourself in New York as a tech person.
Yeah, and I think also as a wake-up call to the people who run the city, and they're like, well, they own the whole. I mean, literally, this building is like an embodiment of what we're talking about here.
It was the funniest thing. For the longest time, we tried to get people to pay attention to the fact that we were running a tech organization in New York City. It wasn't until we made a massive real estate investment that people were like, "Whoa, that's interesting."
Yeah, well, New York,
Sad, but
New York still is very much driven by real estate. I mean, most of the great fortunes that have been made in New York over the past 300 or 400 years have been made in real estate. So I guess that sort of was why that.
Or even funding a great presidential campaign. So there you go.
There you go. I hadn't even thought about that, and that's absolutely true.
So you mentioned government. So from your point of view, how's the New York City leadership helping, hindering? What could they do differently? What have they done that's great in the last couple of administrations?
Well, so I'm a little bit of a libertarian, and there's a part of me which says that the best thing that government can do is get out of the way. And I think in large measure government has gotten out of the way in the sense that they haven't made life more difficult for tech companies that want to work in New York, and that's a good thing. I also think that the Bloomberg administration kind of really woke up to what was going on in New York with the tech sector probably about halfway through the second term in office, and they did a great job of amplifying all of that and cheerleading it, and cheerleading's a big deal, like particularly from City Hall to be able to shine a bright light on this. That's helped a lot, and that's carried over into the de Blasio administration. They have more or less continued every investment that the Bloomberg administration was making in promoting the tech sector, promoting tech favorable policy and things like that. It doesn't come natural. I don't think it comes as natural to the de Blasio administration as it did to the Bloomberg administration. I mean, the Mayor Bloomberg was an entrepreneur, and he kind of got it. Whereas I think the de Blasio administration, they very much want to continue, that stuff, but I don't know that they kind of feel it in their bones quite the same way, so they maybe have to work harder at it. But I think in large measure the government has been doing the right things.
Yeah, great. So jumping back to your business, what are you excited about in terms of technologies, both on the hardware side, the software side, business models that you think we're sort of maybe underestimating? And I guess don't tell us about the ones that are super secret and are going to they're still on the wraps. But what's out there that we should be paying more attention to?
Well, we're not. Our firm isn't by nature very secretive. So if anybody reads my blog or other writing that we do, none of this will be a surprise. But we're quite interested right now in the impact that technology is having on healthcare. We're particularly interested in the impact that technology is having on education. We're particularly interested in some new areas. So those are some verticals that we're interested in. Some new areas that we have been making some toehold investments in things like Bitcoin and the blockchain, drones, and then one area where I think we're sort of contrarian, although Google is also making a big investment here, is in next generation broadband internet infrastructure. It sounds like kind of a crazy thing for a venture capital firm to be excited about, but we think that the economics of fiber and alternative wireless infrastructure is really quite good. We got this really cool company that's not here in New York, in Portugal. Well, we found them in Portugal, that is building a wireless mesh networks for cities using basically an 802.11p Wi-Fi device that they put on like bus fleets. And as the buses drive around the city, they're basically meshing with each other and provisioning a wireless mesh over the entire city.
What is P, by the way? I haven't heard of P. This is a different frequency or a different protocol?
It's a protocol. It's an 802.11 protocol that's designed for mobile. It's designed, for cars and other moving vehicles. It's very tolerant of
handoffs
and things like that. But that, whether or not that company will be successful, it's an example of an alternative approach to doing wireless broadband that was very interesting to us. So those are some of the things that we're interested in, and we're particularly interested in the blockchain for things that have nothing to do with money. We were talking with a team here today before we started, who's doing some interesting work about saving logins and passwords, and the whole issue of privacy and security and control, and whether I'm letting Google have my passwords. You could store all that stuff on the blockchain, right?
Right.
And you're the only one who has the keys to unlock it. Now, there's some usability issues around that we're gonna have to make this technology easier for the average consumer. I mean, if I told my wife that I was going to store all of her logins on the blockchain, she would completely freak out on me. But as an underlying infrastructure for that, it actually is quite good. So that's another area that we've been poking around.
Right, and to your point, it seems like one of the challenges is making this stuff understandable to people and present it in a way that's kind of more consumer friendly.
Although you can do that with product. You don't have to do that with...
No, right,
You don't
exactly.
have to do that with words. I mean, you could just...
But it feels like the Bitcoin universe is populated with nerds like us who geek out on the nature of how exactly the blockchain works.
Yeah, the Bitcoin world needs a Steve Jobs. It needs somebody who can see the power of the technology and make it just easy to use.
Right. I mean, the good and bad news it feels like about Bitcoin and the blockchain is it's not in the evening news every evening like it used to be.
Right.
And so maybe it's maturing, and behind the scenes, you presumably know more about this. It's becoming a more mature technology.
Yeah, although I do think that the jury is still out on whether or not it's going to be TCP/IP or it's going to be token ring, right? Like, is it going to be the thing that becomes the standard and everybody gets behind it and it opens up all sorts of new possibilities, or is it going to be something that ultimately was a really great piece of engineering? That
probably a couple of IBM people sobbing quietly when you say token ring. Oh.
Yeah, that dates me too.
Yeah.
A lot of people have no idea what token ring is. Reason.
And another investment you briefly mentioned was this drone idea, which I don't know whether that's a small idea or a big idea, but maybe you can describe what the...
Well, the company that we invested in is called DroneBase, and it's really, kind of an obvious idea. Instead of buying a drone yourself, just hire a drone pilot, and they've made it so expensive now. For $399, you can go on the web to dronebase.com. You can pull up a Google map, which is basically their whole UI is built on top of Google Maps. Just map out where you want the pilot to fly, hit send, and give them your credit card, and about a day or two later you get what is kind of like a Dropbox full of the imagery, and you can do whatever you want with it. And it sounds like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but how many applications are there for that? It turns out that there's a lot of applications for that. Way more than I ever thought that there would be. And you tell people about it. You tell people who are in real estate or construction or run a manufacturing business or run an agricultural business or run a mine or they run, any kind of business that has a physical plant. and they're like, oh, do you mean that I could have somebody come do a scan of my facade to make sure that I'm in compliance with local law 5? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think so.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah.
Another application.
Yeah. Yeah, the physical world is fun. I think we operate so much in the virtual world and apps
Right.
on the internet and on phones and so on. So actually, the world is becoming more and more interesting as this technology impinges on physical reality.
Well, the way I think about drones is that drones are probably the easiest form of robotics for society to adopt because they fly, right? As opposed to having to walk or something like that, right? So the number of things that you need to tell the drone to do relative to a robot, I think, are a lot easier.
Right.
And so I think drones, I guess I already said it, but I think drones are maybe the first big mainstream application of robotics to hit society.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Apart from vacuum cleaners, apart from Roombas going around on the floor, and that's only 2 dimensions. So, so clearly less interesting. So, is there anything else you'd like to share with us? Anything we haven't covered that you're excited about, or you're worried about, or?
Well, you know, I'm a professional worrier, so I worry about a lot of stuff.
We've only got another 5 minutes.
You know, I would say that I worry that the world we live in, and I'm using we maybe more to speak about the venture capital industry or maybe entrepreneurs, but I think it's probably also true for people who work in technology, is a very optimistic world. And, you know, we think that we can solve that problem, we can solve that problem, we can solve that problem. I'm not worried about that problem, I'm not worried about that problem. But, you know, there are a lot of problems in that, you know, we face as a society, and everything from global warming to terrorism, and lots of other things in between. And I think that we in the technology world sometimes live in our own little bubble where things are going so great, and there's all these new technologies coming along, like drones, like the blockchain, other things that, you know, we can get excited about, and so I always worry, you know, that something's gonna come out of left field and catch us by surprise, and we're gonna, you know, be having to deal with it. I mean, and we've been through that in New York with 9/11 and other things that have happened. So we've lived through that a little bit. So I'm not like you know, a crazy optimist, but I'm also not pessimistic either. I'm kind of in the middle.
Maybe we should, if you're up for it, take some questions from the audience. If you want to step up to the microphones, if you've got any questions. Yeah, we've got somebody over there.
Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.
My question, I haven't formulated it maybe well enough, so let me know if it's completely unclear. So in regards to computer science education, if you said, oh, it's very important we teach kids Python, or it's very important we teach kids JavaScript, you'd say that's kind of the wrong level of granularity, right? You know, like, it doesn't really matter which language you teach, you can always pick up a new one. And I guess I'm curious how you'd respond to the assertion that maybe coding itself is the wrong level of granularity to teach to kids. I hear so much focus around like learning to code, learning to code, learning to code. And is there a more general set of skills that we should be teaching rather than coding itself?
Yeah, coding is in my mind a proxy for the basic skill of telling a machine what to do. Like, that's the thing that I want everybody to know how to do, because I think that we as society are gonna rely more and more on machines to do things that we want them to do. And I think that the basic thing, like, I know how to tell a machine what to do, I know how to write a set of instructions that a machine can process. So Leanne, who's here in the audience, I think, who used to teach computer science, maybe some days still does teach computer science, told me that she likes to start kids off with robots. And I said, why do you do that? And she said, well, because it teaches them very quickly that the instructions that they gave the machine were incorrect when the robot smashes into the wall. And that's like the fundamental thing. Like, the fundamental thing that I want to make sure people understand is the art and science and techniques of instructing machines what to do. and that, unfortunately, that's not as sexy as the word coding. So we use the word coding, but I think what we really mean is whatever technique is required for humans to tell machines what to do is the thing I want us to be teaching.
Thank you.
We've got somebody over here.
Hey, thanks for coming. I have this question regarding your views about Indian startup ecosystem. Are you involved in it? How do you see it growing? And do you see yourself being involved in it?
Well, so I don't know a ton about the Indian startup ecosystem because we don't invest in India. You know, our general rule is if we can get to a company within a 6 or 7 hour plane ride, we'll invest there. So that basically is a big, circle that you draw around New York, and it kind of gets to most of Canada and most of Western Europe and a little bit of Latin America and all of the West Coast. And that has to do with just being able to visit our investments relatively frequently without having to put people on the ground somewhere else. But what I know is that, with the exception of probably China, India has the most significant entrepreneurial community. And in some ways, I think the Indian entrepreneurial community is more sustainable and more healthy because it's a real economy. In China, there's a lot of government support and protection for their companies, and that's not the case in India. So I think Indian entrepreneurs are building great companies in the same way that entrepreneurs build great companies here in the States or in Western Europe. And there's a lot of people in India who have gone back to India and brought back lessons that they've learned working in technology companies in the States. And that's also, I think, generating a lot of the growing vitality over there.
Thank you.
There's somebody here.
So you mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned the troubles with NJ Transit. So I live in New Jersey, as do many people here. And between the devastation of Hurricane Sandy and then Hurricane Christy, I guess in the opposite order, we're facing a bit of a crisis with the Hudson rail tunnels. There's only 2 tubes that are damaged by Sandy, and the ARC tunnel isn't happening. So what do you think is the role that tech companies here who are facing, a potential housing shortage if when those tunnels go in for repair, what's the role that you think they can play in helping solve this problem?
Well, I think the solution is they got to build another tunnel, right? I mean, that is the solution. And I think this is a political problem. It's not a technical problem. I mean, and it's not a financial problem. There just isn't the political will, and part of the problem is that the New York Transit ecosystem is not a centralized system. There's lots of different governing bodies and so on and so forth. So I think what the large employers in New York City, and it's not just the tech companies, but certainly Google would be an important one, along with J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and a bunch of other big companies. I think that the leaders of those companies need to go to the people who are in control of these decisions and demand it. I mean, it's just I think that decision that Christie made probably will go down in history as one of the dumbest decisions ever in the history of the development of the New York metropolitan area. I mean, it's a huge problem. So I think the employers in New York need to get involved in creating the political will to turn that decision around. And we're set back 5-7 years, but we're not set back forever.
Can we have your help?
I'm happy to be a voice.
One last question.
Hey there. So, Fred, thank you so much again for coming here. I'm a huge fan. I've been lurking on AVC forever. So I love that this is my first interaction with you instead of actually posting a comment. So a few things that you brought have me really interested and love to get your thoughts on. I think that it's very important, like you're saying, to get children in schools really interested about technology and coding and seeing that area of opportunity. But I think there's another way to maybe take that further. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on what we can do to get incubators, accelerators, and those kinds of things into some of these other boroughs that you're talking about. So Brooklyn definitely has a few. Queens is kind of on the edge of that. There's a few things kind of out there. But what we can do to kind of drive those ecosystems in the Bronx and Staten Island, Long Island, those kinds of things, and get some of those communities and those schools that you were talking about more interested because they'll have role models in the industry, folks who are actually getting these jobs and careers, and also the inverse of that question in terms of developing that talent and supporting that talent in some of these boroughs. So that's kind of a loaded one, but.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. And, there's there are a couple of models out there that are interesting. I think it's called the Coalition for Queens.
Yeah. Yep.
Would be an interesting model to look at. I think what I think is the right approach is to go to organizations who are already on the ground in these boroughs or in these communities, and find partners who would be willing to do a lot of the work of staffing up a facility, of doing the grassroots work in the community to make people aware of it, and then bringing in the technology partners, whether it's a CSNYC or a Flatiron School or a General Assembly or somebody else who has the know-how from the point of view of bringing the curriculum to the organization. And there is also a role in government. There's a pretty large organization in the New York City government around continuing education and adult education and retraining and things like that. So there's dollars that could be leveraged there as well. So I think that there's no question we need to do that. And I think the right approach is not to try to spin up a new organization to do all this work, but to try to figure out how to get existing organizations and bring them to places like the Coalition for Queens, or bring them to places like General Assembly or Flatiron School, or there's lots of other coding boot camps and accelerators and incubators around. Show them what's possible that they could build in their own communities. So it also might be interesting to get the New York Public Library interested in this, because they have facilities all over. The thing that a lot of people don't realize is the New York library system is really two systems, for a bunch of reasons that I don't have time to go into. But they have a lot of facilities, and a lot of people in the community go there to access the internet and use computers and things like that. So they already have some of the mind share in the community as a place that they might go to do something like that. And obviously libraries have to reinvent what they're all about, because they're not going to be about getting books. So that'd be another idea in that vein.
Thanks so much.
Great. Well, let's wrap it up. Thank you again, Fred, for coming. If you're interested in finding out more about CSNYC, it's on the internet. There's a website.
CSNYC.org.
Yep.
Pay attention next week. As I said, I don't want to pre-announce anything, but there's some exciting stuff coming in the near term, and that we've been working on for a long time. And so more to say on that.
Thank you for everything you do in New York City, and thank you for coming along today. Great, thank you. That was excellent.
It's fun. It was really good.